I've been talking about the book I've been working on, The Unwow, Your Blueprint for Experience Designs of All Kinds. As you might know or imagine, it takes a lot of work to write a book. It also takes a lot of help from a lot of other people. And now you can help me by supporting my book publishing campaign. I have created a number of support levels where you can help me make The Unwow a reality. Head over to my website, theunwow.com, and hit the button for Support the Unwow. You'll be linked to my campaign page where you can not only support the book, but join the Unwow author community. Again, go to theunwow.com, hit the Support the Unwow button, and choose a level that is appropriate for you or your organization to support my work in publishing the book. That link is going to be live next week, but you will be taken to the page that is the preliminary set of different levels that you can support. That support will be live next week, but right now you can head over to theunwow.com, hit the Support the Unwow button, and see where you can help me make the Unwow a reality. Now, on to the show.
1, 2, 3.
Hi, I'm Gary David. Welcome to Experience by Design, the podcast where we explore experience designs of all kinds. Hello, experience designers and EXDers everywhere. Hope you are doing well. I just had the pleasure of traveling to New Orleans to take in the art, music, museums, and culture that the city has to offer. And trust me, it has a lot to offer. If you've never been down there, I highly recommend going and checking it out. A city that old and with so much history has so much to offer on so many levels that truthfully it would take a lifetime to explore, let alone even attempt to understand. I did not have a lifetime. I had about 4 days, 3 days maybe. Depends how you count it. But in that period of time, I was able to take in a lot and develop a deeper appreciation for a place that I had visited before, but never really tapped into. During my trip, I chatted with a lot of people who were from there or moved there, talking about what the city is like 20 years now after Hurricane Katrina. And parts of the city, like the lower Ninth Ward, are still reeling from the impacts of the hurricane and the flooding. The whole city is still being impacted by the financial mismanagement and theft allegations that happened after the storm, including the former mayor and the former chief of police. So there you go. If you ask people, or don't even ask them about it, they will tell you all about it, all about their opinions, all about all the transgressions, and all about their continued hope for a future, a rebirth, so to speak, of New Orleans. Despite the empty buildings and empty storefronts and empty homes, there is still life in the city, as there has been now for centuries. The legacy of New Orleans is full of different moments that define different periods. The more dramatic the hardship, it seems, the greater the opportunity for the return. The higher the mountain, I guess, to climb, the greater the reward when you reach the top. And it does seem like the potential for hardships is only going to increase for all of us, given the climate changes we have seen taking place this summer, with Katrina being perhaps an early harbinger of things to come. You can't turn on the news without seeing stories about massive weather conditions, heat waves, forest fires, rain, all kinds of impacts that we're trying to figure out and come to grips with. And the worst hasn't happened yet. You know, the worst may be yet to come, unfortunately, and we'll have to reckon with that. My guest today on Experience by Design is here to talk about the trajectory we are on and what it will mean for all of us if we don't do something to change its course. Gerry McGovern has had a career working with organizations to identify customer needs and how to position themselves for digital transformation. Now, he is leading with a different message about how we need to address the impacts of techno-capitalism for this generation and future ones as well. His book, 99th Day, A Warning About Technology, was published in February 2026. In it, Gerry talks about the impending environmental and social collapse brought on by things like data centers, AI, and other technologies that take our shared resources for themselves in the pursuance of individual greed, and how, despite the proclamations and promises of shared benefit of these technologies, the writing seems to be on the wall that it ain't going to play out that way. We cover a lot of territory in our conversation. We discuss how we are risking life on Earth to create AI slop. All those cute little cat videos come with a price. Gerry calls out the promises of a brighter technological future, given the actual impacts we are seeing on the environment and society. His initial explorations of digital waste led to a greater realization regarding the impacts of mining waste and other byproducts of unrestrained profit-seeking and growth. As he observes, we are on a fast train to a massive crash unless we start to reevaluate our priorities, policies, and positions on techno-capitalism. And we all play a part in terms of our patterns of consumption and the marketing engines that drive it and us to endlessly buy stuff we don't need and to consume in a pace that is not sustainable. Ultimately, Gerry calls for us to give up and grieve for the civilization we currently have in order to bring into existence the civilization that we need in this moment. But like with New Orleans, the more desperate the situation, the greater the opportunity for the recovery and rebirth. And it's something that Gerry is asking us to embrace. That is, only if we do the work necessary to bring this new future into being and become good ancestors to future generations. It's a different kind of conversation here on Experience Design, but actually a very important one about the experiences that we are designing for this generation, for future generations, and the planet itself. Hope you enjoy it. Do people in Ireland celebrate St. Patrick's Day? Is this like a thing that you still do since we're a few days after?
Oh, they definitely do. Yeah, it's a big thing. There'd be 500,000 people on the streets or more. So it's still a very big celebration in Ireland.
And how do they do it there? Because I know how it's done here. Because I see the young people going out and drinking heavily. And in Chicago, they turn the river green, which I've seen in person, which is great. What are the festivities like in Ireland around St. Patrick's Day?
Well, it used to be very traditional, and each town would have floats, and that would be very conservative, and the local GA club and agricultural groups and stuff like that. And then in the 90s or so, it became much more global and much more ambitious and much more certainly exciting from a young person's point of view. So there's a lot of spectacle and performance, and kind of it's like a circus to some degree. And yeah, there's a lot of drinking, although the culture in Ireland is significantly changing now. The pubs are closing at huge numbers, and gyms are opening up. So there's a big shift in Irish culture underway, but certainly St. Patrick's Day would be a day when a lot of people would get drunk.
I want to talk about that a little bit more, about the ways in which culture and consumerism elevates things to different levels. But you made me think of something. I had a student last year, a graduate student, do a semester-long project on the interior design of Irish pubs. And you might find this interesting. One of the things he found out in his research was that there was a person who essentially created the Irish pub kit. That if you wanted to open up an Irish pub in the United States, that this is the kit you needed to make it look quote unquote authentic. And one of the things he did in his research as well was go onto Google Maps and look in Ireland at actual Irish pubs. And what he found was they really don't look anything like what it is that we have been taught an Irish pub looks like here in the United States, based on this packaging of cultural artifacts in a particular kind of way that then creates the experience of an Irish pub in the United States.
Yeah. Well, I think the older we get, the older we realize that, everything is a lie. or certainly 95% of everything is a lie, and that's the way it is. Everything has become intensely marketing and intensely branding, and it's important that it's a good emotional story, etc., rather than it have any accuracy in it. So yeah, in the US there has been long this image of Ireland, etc., that isn't always what Ireland is. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't, and sometimes you might find Ireland becoming what the USA branded it to be
Right.
20 or 30 years. So you get all this back and forth, but it's a kind of all this, to some degree, sleazy optimization that is the essence of what we get with AI, and the ultimate squeezing the dollar out of everything.
It seems to be that way, right?
That's the way we're going. We're squeezing the dollar out of everything with every last piece of life on it has got to be killed to squeeze the dollar out of it. And it seems we're in that final chapter of what I call the growth debt cult. And it's just becoming more and more frenzied, and where it's all going to end up. Well, that's the next question.
Well, it makes me also think about this notion of authenticity, and that as people are able to portray themselves in varying ways online, there's also this call for being, your authentic self, or being authentic. And like we saw with the Irish pub example, that authenticity gets lost in the space of expectations. People aren't creating authenticity outside of expectations, because then the real can seem inauthentic, because I've been taught it should be this thing. So I've been taught that Irish pubs should look a certain way based on the commodification of it. But then when I see a real Irish pub, or a pub just in Ireland, then I'm like, well, this, the authentic thing doesn't meet my expectations, so it seems not authentic, even though it is the real thing. Things get turned upside down, so to speak.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. I remember when I went to my first visit to the US was I was there for a summer with cousins in Chicago and stuff like that, and a group brought me out one night to this. It was a Mexican restaurant, but they had these wonderful meals and strawberry milk. They were known for their strawberry milkshakes, and it was made from real milk and real strawberries. And the group of young people that I was with had told me this great story about you have to have the strawberry milkshakes here, and eventually when I got the strawberry milkshake, I was really disappointed, because I'd been used to having the McDonald's piece of processed crap strawberry milkshake, and it was disappointing. The real strawberries were and real milk were disappointing. So yeah, nature is so disappointing to us modern humans. We are so processed from our hair down to our feet, and so online, that when we actually touch anything connected with wild nature, we are both scared and shocked, and we run back to our smartphones or our laptops or our air-conditioned offices to recover from being touched by something that actually might be real.
I think Socrates said something about that. Aristotle, with the allegory of the cave, right?
That was Plato. Yeah, I think it was
Plato. I'm sorry, I get my three main Greek philosophers screwed up. But it's like the thing that I'm seeing on the cave wall is my reality, and then when one escapes and goes outside and sees the real world, they become so frightened that they run back into the cave to see the representations on the cave wall as as a comfortable thing, because the real thing is just too far out of what they're used to be appreciated. So freedom is rejected for this cave existence of representation.
Something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. It kind of sounds, this is when we think about, the worlds in which we're living and we, in a manner of speaking, there's people talking about, for instance, that the internet is dead, right? That there's so much stuff on the internet that's not real, that it's, AI slop or AI generation, that it's not even a real thing anymore because it's just a representation of a real thing.
Yeah, but that hasn't changed a lot. I mean, AI has just accelerated the production of this stuff, and what it becomes more and more obvious is that these unreal things. In 2020, I published a book called Worldwide Waste, and the first sentence was "digital is physical," and I think with AI, we finally truly see that the cloud is on the ground, because all this unreality has an incredible and growing cost, of atoms and materials and energy and water, and we're in this process now of wiping out life on Earth to create AI slop.
Right.
That's our mission. It seems to create out of reality unreality until we've drained the last piece of reality, and then we realize that actually we can't exist without the real world. We can't exist without some fresh water and some clean air and some soil that hasn't been destroyed. We'll realize we actually do need that.
Right.
And as we, dwindle as a species, maybe we'll end up in that cave, with some regrets.
Well, one of the things that I talk about this a lot, people might be tired of me talking about it, but I like to remind my students, especially, that the beginning of the movie The Matrix is predicated on the AI taking over, and the only useful thing it can see for us humans to be is an energy source. And so it hooks us up as energy sources, but to keep us kind of placated, it creates the Matrix, which is this fictionalized world of unreality that we see as being real. And that's how they maintain their survival, is by using our energy from our bodies, because all the natural energy on the earth has been destroyed.
Something, yeah. It's a good analogy, and there was this physicist that did this mapping of what he called the exoskeleton of the human. So we are an energy source. We consume energy and we produce energy, and we, at rest are maybe 100 watts of energy. If we're exerting ourselves, we're maybe at 300 watts of energy. And this physicist, he said, well, if you wrap around our phones and our screens and our cars and our air conditioning and all this other stuff that we kind of walk around with or walk around connected with, he calculated all the energy and the wattage of that. So we went from the so-called primitive human who is living within their environment, who may be out hunting and running around, they're consuming 300 watts. So we went from that 300 watts maximum consumption to about 11,000. Oh,
wow.
In the process, when we put in all the supporting networks and everything.
Right.
So we are, so the AI actually shutting us off would be probably a much better option, and just consuming the energy direct. So I don't see much of an actual use case for an AI ultimately having us hanging around.
Right.
I think it would probably prefer to go and get the water directly and get the electricity directly, and just wipe us out in the process.
Well, hopefully AI is not listening to that right now. but I think it probably has its ideas of its own. As different simulations have shown, I forgot what it was that, like, for those of us who are old enough to watch the movie War Games, the notion that that the computer is launching this effort on its own to start a nuclear war because that it thinks it's a simulation. That recently there have been simulations run where I think it might have been like half the time or something like that. AI felt like, it would be better off without humans on the earth.
Yeah, that would, and this is, the idea of agency or no agency. I mean, we're still, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that, it ends up doing something. Whether it did it with intent or not is irrelevant. Whether it has a mind or not is irrelevant. What matters is if it launches nukes. That's whether it did that through a miscalculation, a calculation, intent, no intent. That's that. We're all sitting here, trying to say, does it have a soul? Does it have a mind? Does it have? It's not important. What's important is its capacity to do harm or damage, which it's very evidently, capable of doing. Even if it is an advanced autocomplete machine, it can autocomplete really quickly how many missiles to send, and that's the nature of digital and modern technology is speed. It does things faster, and we love speed, but we're not built for speed. We have built machines that move way faster than we are really physically able to deal with, and we will suffer the consequences of that probably sooner rather than later.
So if I was going to jump back a little bit, what led you to this series of work around, your new book, The 99th Day, and your other work that you've done? What was the process where you came to it? Was this something that you were always thinking about, or was there something that happened that caused you to focus in on this more as an area of discussion?
It's probably a long journey that I started in the web, back in 1993, and I bought and subscribed to and sold the whole concept of ethereality, and that ultimately became the branding, the cloud, that digital was somehow this pure, lighter thing. Don't print out the email. Print is bad. Emails are good. There was this whole thing that was really a religion type in many ways, that digital was walking lighter on the earth. So that was a thing that I believed for a good 20 years, and then Greta Thunberg came along, and it was at a stage where I was nearing the end. I'd had a very successful career, done well, and didn't need to work as hard. And I thought, oh, there's this wonderfully idealistic young person, and there's loads of like her, and maybe there's something over here in digital that can be done better. We're already doing a fabulous job over here, but maybe we can do stuff better. And so started a journey maybe around 2017. I didn't expect to find much. I remember around then, 2016, there was this data center proposed for Galway in Ireland, an Apple data center. And I remember reading the papers, and there was an objection to it, and thinking, what the hell are these people objecting to? Why? What's bad about a data center? It's going to be great. It's going to modern, blah, 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 etc. So back around 2016, I was totally, data is great. The more we can have, the better, etc., etc. But then I began to dig in, and I began to see the history of Silicon Valley, how it was all about deceit from its very origins. They wanted this break from the smokestacks, and so instead of calling it factories, they called them campuses and parks. So it was heavy propaganda. So they needed huge chemicals for the silicon chips, 400 chemicals, and they hid all the chemicals in chemical tanks underground. And because they did that, the chemical tanks seeped, and Silicon Valley became one of the most toxic places on earth for a period of time. And I was thinking, wow, that doesn't sound very ethereal, does it? And so I was getting all these contra stuff, and then e-waste became a thing that I began to notice, and how it was surging, and how we only recycle about 5% of e-waste, and every new chip was less recyclable. And then I met this wonderful scientist in Canada called Josh Lebowski, and he had done work on e-waste, but he was telling me, listen, e-waste is bad. Yeah, it's really, really bad. But if you want the story of digital and our modern civilization, look at mining waste. And I said, what the hell? And I was annoyed. I remember being annoyed at him because I was so focused on e-waste. I said, I'm not interested in that stuff, mining waste. Who could care about mining waste? But anyway, a couple of weeks later, I began to just dig a little and look around. Wow, and I discovered this extraordinary story that nobody wanted to hear about mining waste, because as Josh Lebowski told me, he says, like, basically for every ton of e-waste, there's 1,000 or 10,000 ton of mining waste. And so I began to just go into Brazil. There's a state in Brazil called Minas Gerais, which means general mines. So it's a state that's probably half the size of Europe that they just call general mines, and
right.
They just destroy everything to get out the steel and whatever, the lithium. And then I looked at Spain. There's a huge area called the Rio Tinto that they've been mining for 6,000 years. And wow, the stories you'd see about the devastation that occurred in Ireland, and has not as big a mining history, but I discovered that one of the largest aluminium plants in Europe is in Ireland. And that was a journey I said with aluminium. Apple going, oh, green, oh, we're lovely and green and aluminium. And then you discover that aluminium comes from bauxite, and the place you find bauxite is under tropical trees. So to get your bauxite, you have to wipe out the Amazon or the African. So I began to discover that every story I opened about tech was this monstrosity of harm and waste that lay underneath it. And, and then I remember being investigating data center energy use and reading all these stories about, oh, it's ridiculous. What are you going on about? It's, there's nothing happening here. Look, it's less than 1% of total US or whatever electricity. And this is the exponential story, it looks so tiny for so long. So they were saying, no, there's nothing here. We're so efficient. It's less than 1%. And then all of a sudden it's 1%, then it's 3%, then it's 9%. So back in 2020, there was the story, what are you going on about? It's less than 1% of US electricity. Now it's 7%, and it's going to be 9%. And that's exponential growth. And they're telling the same story about water now. Oh, AI, it's less than 1% of the water. Right. What are you going on about? It's ridiculous. We're not used. Oh, look at the golf course and look at those farmers and stuff like that. And then in another 3 or 4 years, oh, it's 6%, is it? Oh, my bad. What happened? So sorry about that. Now we're taking 15% of your water, etc. So this horror story of tech, but tech has bought everyone. So whether it's the European Union or the Irish government, nobody can tell this story because everyone's bought off. And the whole renewable energy story is just another con, that it's renewable, that it's green, and what we have, of course, is the perfect debate for the energy industry, comparing energy, comparing the energies. We're not looking at the real problem, which is consumption. This wonderful geophysicist said to me, Tom Murphy from University of California, he's retired now. I asked him at one stage, well, what's the difference between fossil fuels and renewable energies? And he said, it's like, a bullet to the head or the guillotine. Because he says, the real issue is what we do with the energy.
Right.
It's this crazy society that we're driving, with the energy that's doing most of the damage, that's causing the sixth mass extinction and water, depletion and all these other issues. But of course, as long as as we have the story, and this is where the Greens are as well, as long as we have, renewable energy is better than fossil fuel, we're having the totally wrong debate. And that's exactly where the energy industry wants us to be, is comparing energy sources.
Right.
In the process, because then we're not asking the real questions of what are we using all this energy for?
It reminds me of, and the book and the documentary, the animated documentary, The Story of Stuff, which was back in the early 2000s, and also Travels of a T-Shirt in the Global Economy, which is a nice book, because looking at the larger systemic implications rather than just in isolation these single points of consideration. That it's broader and deeper than just whether it's wind or solar or coal or oil. It's, well, why do we need it in the first place? Like, what are we doing with it?
And what's its total impact? I've talked over the last 5 or 6 years, I've talked to probably hundreds of scientists, and I've asked them, where is the research on total impacts on the environment or of these technologies or these metals? And I haven't been able to discover the research. It doesn't seem to exist. You look at now, we're saying copper is essential to this green transition, right? So copper is one of the most damaging metals to mine. All mining is extremely damaging, but copper is extremely damaging. Now, we need to mine more copper in the next 25 years than in all of previous history. That's like something like 700 million tons of copper. Now, it's much, 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 much worse than you think it is on that level. Because mining a ton of copper in 1920 would have caused about 30 tons of toxic mining waste. And that's not dealing with what's called the strip ratio, which is the soil that needs to be taken away before you get down to the actual ores. But because of ore degradation, basically, we found all the best ores early, and now they're much, there's much more impurities and they're much more spread. In 2020, we'd be creating 180 tons of waste. But not just that, the actual energy input since 1900 has gone up about 16-fold. So when you're actually working with lower grade ores, you have to process them more. You need more chemicals, you need more diesel fuel, etc., etc. And of course, you need an awful lot more water as well in the process. So we're getting this thing that is, for every ton of copper we're getting about 180, 200 tons of toxic waste, and then all sorts of other soil waste in the process. And that's a green energy. So if we look at fossil fuels, which are absolutely terrible, the essential, they don't have much mining waste in most situations. It's just if you're hitting a borehole and you're straight into your gas or your oil. The waste in fossil fuels occurs at burning, and it's of course extraordinarily damaging. It creates CO2. But the waste in copper occurs at mining, most of it. So what happens to all that shit, basically? Well, it's going to flood into river, like the Zambian rivers. There, 9 or 12 months ago, there was a huge flood from a mine, and all of these mines will collapse. They are not designed to last more than 20 or 30 years. So all of this massive quantity of waste that occurs in, mining copper, mining aluminium, these so-called green, the damage, as you said, we're focused on one metric. It's the tunnel vision of we gotta sort the CO2, but we're willing to do this to wipe out the Andes, the entire Andes ecosystem, and 30 major communities to get lithium. So we're going to totally dry out the Andes because lithium mining requires huge quantities of water, etc., etc. We're going to wipe out the Hungana Manyawa in Indonesia, one of the few uncontacted tribes left on Earth, to get nickel.
Right.
And the interesting thing about nickel is another green metal. Nickel is driving a coal boom in Indonesia because the process, they have a very dirty nickel ore and it requires huge processing. So they're getting a massive coal boom in Indonesia to process the green nickel for our renewables in the process. And we're being told this story of, oh, just focus on the CO2. No, don't look at all these billions of tons of toxic waste that is flooding the soil and flooding the rivers and wiping out the Amazon and indigenous communities. And you're thinking, this is the green establishment that is going to people in Hawaii and telling them, listen, we're going to have to mine the deep seas to get the nodules for the green transition. But it's the same old colonial story. It's green colonialism. Like 3 or 4 centuries ago, the priests came with the soldiers and the miners and the scientists, and the priests blessed, the mining in South America by saying these were savages and et cetera, et cetera. And now the Greens are blessing the wiping out of the Amazon and Chile and Indonesia by saying, well, it's all for a good cause. It's all for the green transition. But really, it's all to save our civilization. It's not to save nature.
Well, especially, and one of the inherent things in this is, the idea that in many ways, globalization is just a process to make invisible the things that we rely on to support our way of, quote unquote, way of life. That in West Virginia, you have, basically, clearing the tops off of mountains to mine, which then destroys the rivers. And we don't want to see that in our backyard, or we want to see it in a limited amount. So let's do it over there where no one can see it.
Exactly.
And so then it shows up here and it's out of sight, out of mind. And so globalization is not just an economic system. It's not just a cultural system. It's a production system that makes us feel better about the things that we're buying.
Exactly. I was talking to this rough conversation with a group there last week, and one of them was saying, but somehow the conversation came around. We were talking about plastics, and he was saying, saying, but they're really, it's not really our problem. Look at those Asians. They're really horrible with the way they look after plastics. It's far more plastics coming into the oceans or originating in places like the Philippines and Indonesia and Thailand than there is in Europe. We're much better at this sort of thing. And I was telling the guy, well, you know why that is? Do you? And he said, yeah, because they're not good at recycling and stuff like that. Well, no, that's actually not why it is. Why it is Europe and North America is dumping their plastics in Indonesia and small communities that have no capacity to manage these avalanches of plastic. Of course, you might see the source being Indonesia, but the actual plastic is from a Coca-Cola wrapper that somebody in Seattle threw away three years ago. So this classic outsourcing harm that we do, and as you say, so that we look clean, so that the UK are always going on about how they've no more coal, and that's because they're just a financial shell. They don't build anything anymore anyway, so they don't need any coal. But they've sent it all to all the work to China. Like China's the model. All the Greens love to talk about China and love to talk about how wonderful and green. Well, China burns more coal every year than all the rest of the world combined. China is opening up 6 times more coal plants every year than all the rest of the world combined. So China's doing everything for security. It's doing wind, it's doing solar, etc. Not that I have anything against China, an extraordinary culture, amazing. But this idea that China is green and that the UK can pretend it's green because it sent all the dirty work to China, to using Chinese coal in the process. And then, they have these biofuels in the UK where they're pulling trees from Mississippi, I think, and from old growth forests in Canada. So they're cutting down old growth forests in Canada, shipping the pellets over to England and burning them and saying that's green in the process, because they can do all this clever carbon accounting in the process. So it's all this, yeah. How do we shift the blame and so that we look clean and green, and we can push it all over to Africa or push it all? But ultimately, it's coming around. There is no way on this planet. Ultimately, the quantities of waste become so great that they affect the water systems, they affect the air systems, they affect. So we're getting the reckoning. The coming around moment is beginning to arrive.
And what is that? What are you seeing, and what gives you the sense that this reckoning is coming around, and how do you see that reckoning play out?
Well, if you're talking to, say, Tom Murphy, how he, and I broadly agree, we're going to have an incredible collapse, a population collapse along with it. Yeah, some people think down to maybe 1 billion people. Tom Murphy thinks it could go down as low as 100 million. So we are totally stressing everything, acidifying the oceans. We've pumped so much fresh water that we've altered the Earth's tilt. The continents are drying out. And people say, yeah, but we just do desalination. Well, desalination requires infrastructure, it requires fossil fuels.
Right.
And for every litre of water, you create 1.5 litres of toxic brine, which kills the coasts around it. So we're reaching all these tipping points. There's no rain that rains today that doesn't have forever chemicals in it. So we're into chemical overload, and we're wondering, why don't we, have our sperm getting weaker, all these. We live in a toxic land of chemicals that are constantly interacting. And these sorts of interactions are going to keep increasing. As I said, oceans acidifying, plastic, microplastics that are now transferring through the veins into the brain, etc., etc. All of this stuff, you can't keep doing this. 40% soil collapse. So 40% of global soils are under severe stress. And by another 30 or 40 years, up to 80 or 90%, we are approaching a point, all that mining I was talking about copper, etc., where actually mining waste is reaching the equivalent of a Mount Everest every year. So Mount Everest is about 175 billion tons mass. Now, you can't disturb a Mount Everest every year on the planet without having a significant impact on the environment, on water, on air currents, on etc. All of this stuff, these wind turbines, if you roll enough wind turbines out, you're going to change the weather. Because what a wind turbine does is it takes air at 100 kilometers an hour, and it takes 30 kilometers of air out of it, of speed out of it, and it turns that into energy. So if you've got these all over the place, you're going to change the weather. But you don't really. Weather's a very complex thing,
right?
So we're doing all these things without, just because we can, and that you find even in we dump our e-waste in Africa, right? But we're dumping so much of the e-waste in Africa that it's now seeping into the oceans. So the European trawlers that are doing the trawling off the African coast are getting tuna that's full of metals and rare earths, right, from the e-waste that we send. So this is part of the coming. Like, e-waste is the fastest growing waste in the world. And again, it's hidden because we send it all to Africa or we send it to Indonesia. But this ultimately gets back into the soils, it gets back into the water, and these sorts of damages are just picking up speed. Like, we did 3 times the damage to our environment between 1970 and 2020 than we did in the previous 200,000 years. That's an unbelievable statistic. 3 times more damage in 50 years than in 200,000 years. And now with AI, that's just another acceleration
Right.
in the process. So it's really hard to see us surviving another 70 years without incredible collapsing systems.
Right. I was reading your recent newsletter article, blog article, and it was dealing with water and aquifers. And I get my water from an aquifer. And every time I turn on the faucet, I'm amazed it works, because I just can't, I can't fathom that there's a water source that exists somewhere underground that's capable of feeding so many different homes and communities and things like that. And I'm just, I'm from Michigan. I'm from the Great Lakes. So I'm used to seeing big bodies of water. And there was a little bit more security about having water. But I'm like on an aquifer. I'm like, I don't know how big this thing is. I don't know when it's going to run out. So every time I turn on the faucet, I expect there to be no water whatsoever. And that's what
well, the aquifers are running out.
That's what you were writing about.
We are literally draining, because gravitationally water will go to the seas, because the sea is the lowest point. So there's a wonderful book by a wonderful author called Erica Guys, called Water Always Wins, and she has a tremendous concept in it that she calls slow water, and she's ancient groups, indigenous groups otherwise, had techniques to slow the water down, because when it rains interiorly, if you don't have the right systems, then the water moves quickly to the rivers and then it moves to the seas. So, by putting ducts, by having forests, by having differences, you can have techniques that will slow the water. Because if you slow the water, then it has time to seep into that aqueduct and fill it back up again. But if it's very flat, like agricultural land that's been severely compacted by heavy machinery and has not had time to regenerate, to allow the soils to aerate, etc., then the water tends to go like across a road, so you don't get the seepage and filling in the aqueduct. So basically, we are pumping water out aqueducts much faster than we are filling them. And here's a story in poorer countries of solar panels. In India and Afghanistan and Pakistan, poor farmers are using solar panels to pump water 24 hours, 24 a day out of their aqueducts. So as they get this sudden boom for their agricultural fields. So they used to be able to eke out a living, just by the natural flows or the natural rains, but now they've got this sudden boom of water. But of course, what happens is within 3 or 4 years, they're drying up their aqueducts, and they're desertifying their areas. So this is what Tom Murphy was talking about. It's what you do with the energy. This solar panel used to drain an aqueduct is not a good idea. But this is happening all over the world in the process. We're saying, this is cheap energy. The worst thing we can have is cheap energy, because it encourages waste. It encourages, I can leave the TV on 24/7, etc. in the process. So yeah, all over the world, you can read stories about Turkey. There's water stress all over the world. It's getting much, much worse. And in the middle of this jumps in AI saying, I want my share. I want my share. I'm a new entity coming in saying, I got to get my water.
Right. It makes me think about another thing, which is, I think about companies. Well, let me back up. Our culture, especially in the United States, is predicated on growth equals success. And that to be successful means constant growth, but no growth or slow growth doesn't equal failure. I mean, you have companies like Patagonia, which has this model of, no growth. We don't want to grow our business because it's not sustainable. And so it makes me wonder about, how do we get to this cultural moment where we're shifting this mindset, given the extraordinary social forces that are predicated on supporting it and spreading that mindset.
100%. I mean, you've summarized the challenge, and I think, Gerry, that basically we're on a fast train to a massive crash. So if we're lucky, in the book, I kind of talk about the long retreat. We might, if we're lucky, have a long retreat. So we will hit a number of mini crashes. But, this capitalist train has got to hit an incredible wall, right? And then after that, there will be a moment. In many civilizations, because I've read the history of civilizations, it's not looking good. Because usually after a civilization, whether it's the Incas or whatever, the Romans, after they hit one of their crashes, they don't sit around and say, well, what lessons can we learn? Did we overdo things? No,
Right.
They do the opposite. They double down, they treble down. They elect a Trump,
Right.
in the process. So most civilizations, not alone don't learn any lessons, they drive the accelerator even harder. They seem to accelerate into collapse. So that would be the typical historical pattern, unfortunately, of civilizations. However, in the lucky moment that a lot of people, like millions of people, sat around and said, this growth is killing us. This caused the crash. It's a cancer, which it is, in the process. Could we do something different? So that's where no growth or degrowth or living with actual environmental boundaries could become something that a lot of people might listen to. I don't think until we reach an enormous crash, maybe like but much worse, the recession of the 30s. Because that brought about probably the most egalitarian period in US
Right.
history, where
Right.
rich people were taxed 95%, weren't they?
Right.
For a period. And that's when the so-called Make America Great Again was. That's when there was huge, horrible things happening. But for an ordinary working class person, if you were white,
Right.
you could have a pretty decent life because it was a pretty equal society, because the damage of that recession and so I think the best case scenario, there's this concept of good ancestors, that we should have the ideas ready. Right now, if you go with those ideas, Gerry, and as I've gone, they just laugh at you, or else they get angry. People say, you make me angry when you say degrow. Like that's, so people either get angry, ridicule you, laugh at you, but there'll come a point where some of them won't. I think, but it requires an extraordinary collapse first, because there's no way we can go up against Facebook and Google and AI, because AI is essentially an advertising engine. That's what Google is. That's what Facebook is. It's part of the core purpose for me of AI is to create functioning addicts that it can drain $20 off every month or $30. It likes to push. Can I drain 25? How far can I push it? In draining these addicts in the process. So we're not going to challenge that until there's a collapse of mega proportion. But I think we need to have the arguments ready after that collapse to say there's a different way. We don't have to do it that way.
Right.
Not enough people will probably listen to us, but there just might be a chance after that first or second collapse that we could say there's a different way, but we need to have the models ready. And I think we need to do work today that's intergenerational. So it's work that we will never see the benefit of, but our children or their children's children might see the benefit of. So that's the way I look at it. I see there's absolutely no way we can defeat this thing we call capitalism or Google and Facebook and Palantir and stuff like that. But it's so overconfident, it's going to eat itself. It's going to eat it. It's going to try and eat everything else, but in the process, it's going to eat itself because it's not nearly as clever as it thinks it is. Because I've seen the inside of these companies, and I've seen the insides of the code, and I've seen the way these things are designed. And you know what? Programmers and developers are nearly as good as people who don't understand programming and development think they are in the
Right.
process. And this AI is nearly as clever as the government ministers think it is.
Right.
And I think we should have a model for a better society ready for after this stuff really explodes.
I'm glad you mentioned the functioning addicts, because as we were talking, as you're describing this, the immediate thing that came to mind is, an addict, an alcoholic, or somebody needs to hit a rock bottom and before they have a realization. I mean, sometimes people might recognize they have a problem and seek help before that rock bottom, but often you can't convince them, especially if they're functioning, that there's a problem. What do you mean? I go to work, I come home, I make a paycheck, I pay my bills. I'm not one of those people who has a problem. I'm fine. And then something happens, and then they are faced with, no, you do have a problem and you need to seek help. And it's the first step is admitting you have a problem, that you're powerless. That's
Exactly.
the first step. And that's very much similar to this. We are all essentially
100%.
functioning addicts of consumerism. I mean, sure, we might look at Hoarders, the TV show Hoarders, and point at people who shop more than us. And, well, at least I'm not like that person, like an alcoholic would. I'm not on the street. I'm not, homeless. I'm not that bad. I'm fine. Look at me. No, you are. It's just you haven't hit that bottom yet.
Exactly.
You're still addicted.
Exactly. 100%. 100%. And we're at that point where we can't recognize the problem. We can't. No, I don't have a problem. Like the problem is consumption, but we can't even recognize that. We think, no, the problem is energy. The problem is fossil fuels. That's the problem. And if we move to renewables, we've solved the problem. So we look at, anything to divert ourselves away from what the actual problem is. And the problem is consumption. The problem is we are consuming the earth, we are consuming ourselves, we are consuming the water, we are consuming the soil, we're consuming the metals, we're creating this huge waste because what the clever people discovered is that waste is a product. That actually, if you create more waste, you can make more profit. If you glue the phones, the iPhone 12, so that it absolutely can't be repaired, you sell more iPhone 13s.
Right.
So waste is the product. We've now discovered that the more waste we can create, the more short-term profit we can. So we're totally locked into this consumption, what I call growth debt cult, in the process. And, we got to hit that rock bottom. And hopefully when we hit that rock bottom, enough of us will come to our senses. But the danger is that there'll just be another Trump there beating the drum for war or more consumption, or, because you drink even more, in the process. Or, I used to be on liquor, but now I'm on organic beer. That's
right.
better. Yeah.
And we were talking about, before we started recording, as we're talking about this, we're depending upon which person in my government you speak to, we're either at the beginning, middle, or end of the war in Iran. Sometimes all three at the same time. But one of the elements of that is, of course, inflation, because oil prices are going up, and oil prices going up means it costs more to bring things to market, and et cetera, et cetera. And people talk about the rising of prices as a bad thing. Yeah, but it's only bad if you're geared around consumption.
Yeah.
And if also wage can't keep pace with, basic necessities, I understand that. But if things are more expensive and it means we can't buy as much, are we making better decisions about what we are buying and not buying as much stuff we might want, but don't confuse a want with a need. We don't necessarily need. And so that's an interesting element of this inflationary moment of how far it goes do these things potentially provide some kind of break, not long-lasting systemic change, but at least an opportunity to pause and rethink what's a want versus a need? What do I really need? And how do I readjust my consumption habits to better reflect a higher quality of life outside of stuff?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, it's very short-term, Gerry. We saw it in the 70s,
right.
And then Toyota came out of that, because smaller cars and more efficient and stuff like that. But, we saw it a bit with COVID, and people slowed down. But then as soon as
Yeah.
As soon as the cheap oil came back or whatever,
Right.
we were back, because there's such an engine of consumption that, the
Yeah.
marketing, the Google and the Facebook and the advertising agencies, and just this desire, is so strong and so unrelenting, that it's an unstoppable train for the moment. But nature's going to stop that train.
Yeah. Yeah.
Nature's going to stop that train. We're not above nature.
We're not, and like right now, we're recording this in March, and there's already summer level heat waves in the American West and Southwest.
Yeah.
And it's just like, well, then you're like, well, we got some more air conditioning. Okay, great. You have more air conditioning. Well, that air conditioning is trying something from somewhere. And, so we people lose the systemic interconnectedness of all of these elements together, and how you're fixing the symptom, not the problem.
Yeah. And you're feeding the problem.
And you're feeding the problem.
You're feeding the problem, because more air conditioning machines have to be built. They need aluminium, they need all the other stuff, and they need electricity, and they need. So you're feeding the problem when you're often solving the symptom feeds the problem. Like with renewable energy feeds the problem, because it kind of genuflects as well, and tells us that we can consume as much as we want once it's renewable.
Right.
AI is okay once it's using renewable energy. So we've got this a kind of permission indulgences that we're actually selling, and so all of these stories to somehow create this magical technology that will save us. That you see now the green boosters saying that, oh, look at oil is, look at the Straits of Hormuz or whatever, and how that wouldn't happen with solar panels, that wouldn't happen with air turbines. We don't have those straits when it comes to solar panels. Well, sorry, China controls 80% of the solar panel industry.
Right.
China controls at least 80% of rare earths, which are critical to wind. And only 9 months ago or 6 months ago, China put a stop on the rare earths. So we do have the straits. They're just in different places. But this idea that these things are somehow not constrained by global material flows, or that they're not just as globalized as everything else, that these solar panels are somehow things that a kid in their backyard can build over the weekend from local materials. These are extraordinarily concentrated technologies that are right now dominated by China. So we just swap one oligarch, so to speak, for another oligarch.
Right.
And don't focus on what's the real problem. The problem is consumption of energy, not production of energy. And until we focus on the consumption of energy, but we are these functioning alcoholics who can't even say we have a problem.
And I think that this goes to, the idea that what can people do, that recycling as a kind of greenwashing, so to speak, because it's not just recycling, it's less consumption to begin with. Yes, recycle, right? But at the same time, consume less so that there is less to recycle. And maybe that, less consumption drives less production, which is then reflected in less kind of use of these limited resources, right? These are not unlimited resources. These are
100%.
These are finite resources, and a rethinking of and this is a larger problem, but it's an important conversation for people to have, rethinking the entire economic structure. Because, well, if you have less consumption, then we have less production. If we have less production, we have less jobs. Well, there's already less jobs because it's technology. So we need to rethink our fundamental structure of our economy outside of just consumption as a primary driver, and into some other set of economic relationships.
Yeah, that's the huge challenge, and we've been going around from different angles, and like my conclusion from the book is that until a collapse occurs, we will never get a real serious conversation about that, because the forces of consumption and production are so strong and so unrelenting. But we should be building up the theories. I mean, this is degrowth. This is the concepts. We will now be the crazy ones. But for those who can imagine a society that actually lives within the constraints of its environment, because if you don't imagine that society, you won't have a society. Because if you don't live within the constraints of your environment, you will go extinct. You will go, like there was a French philosopher who once said that, before civilizations were forests and after civilizations were deserts. And that's the story of civilizations. That's, we wouldn't be the first one. We'll just be the biggest by far. But the history of civilizations is the history of the destruction of their environment and then their collapse.
Well, that's a lot to think about, and I don't want people who listen to be like, well, there's nothing I can do. I think the first thing you do is monitor your own consumption, and the second thing you do is pay attention to these conversations and, start driving it. Going back to recovery, there's a saying, a slogan of "Let it begin with me," right? And so that's
at a community like the only place I can see the new models emerging are at a community level.
Right.
Because everywhere else is owned. The politicians are owned, the NGOs, the big organizations are owned, the European Union, the UN is controlled.
Sure.
The only space that's left is the local community. That's the only free space that actually is left in this world. And they're trying to control that as much as possible. But that's the only space. So starting up these groups, every time you can save a half acre of land and you can regenerate that land, every time you can protect some water, every time you can protect a mountain, a small forest, you are doing something extraordinary, because you are being a good ancestor, you are leaving something, or at least the chance of something that others can take up after the actual collapse. So absolutely we can do things, and we should resist in everything that we can do. But I'd be working at a local community level where possible, and teaching old skills, and building back these community-based structures, communication structures that are not dependent on digital, like a monthly physical meeting, flyering, knocking on doors. There's an awful lot of stuff that can be done and is being done in many different places. So I'm not fatalistic. Like Tom Murphy, I'm going back to Tom Murphy a lot, but he was saying, I once said, he says, people say I'm a pessimist. He says, I'm not a pessimist. He says, yeah, I'm a pessimist about civilization, but I'm not a pessimist about life. If you love the water, if you love the trees, if you love the birds and the butterflies and the bees and the salmon, and all that sort of stuff, right? Or do you love the AI and the smartphones? Because a choice is coming in the process. And if you love the forests and the trees, there's reasons to be optimistic. There's really reasons to resist. But if you love all the other stuff, you're in for a reckoning.
Well, Gerry, I really appreciate you sharing. It's a hard message to hear, but it's an important message to hear, and it's an important conversation to have. And it's important that people do the things, like you said, at the local level, at the community level, at the home level, the family level, whatever it is, to have the conversations, talk to one another, and start gaming out the future, because whether or not we plan for it, the future is going to happen.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I want to thank Gerry McGovern for joining me to talk about environmental waste, techno-capitalism, recovery, and becoming good ancestors. You can find out more about his work, all of his books, including 99th Day, and his insights in the links in the show notes. As always, you can share feedback about this episode or any episode at feedback@experiencexdesign.com. If you want to stay on top of all of the Unwound news, and you know you do, Head over to theunwow.com, provide your email, and I will keep you in the loop about everything that is happening regarding the Unwow. And there's going to be a lot of news coming up shortly, so stay tuned for that. And as you get ready to plan your next corporate or other event and you want someone to talk about the Unwow, contact me, Gerry David, at Gerry@GerryConnects.com, or DM me through LinkedIn. Happy to chat with you about how I can help bring the spirit, strategy, and execution of the Unwow to your organization to help you do the basics, but better. So contact me at Gerry@GerryConnects.com or DM me through LinkedIn. And as always, be safe, be kind, be well, and be here for the next Experience by Design. Bye.